Hi, I'm Davey, and this is my second video talking about the histories, that is, the etymologies of the most common English words. In the first video, I talked about the and that and some other related words, and here I'm going to talk about the verb to be, which is, of course, the most common verb in English and probably verbs expressing the same idea of existence are the most common in most Indo-European languages, probably most languages in the world. So to be is, of course, a very irregular verb. It has more forms in English than any other verb does. Where a form of a verb I'm defining as just any word that represents the verb in the past or the present, in any person or number, or mode or whatever. So the forms of to be are be, been, being, am, is, are, was, and were, which is 8 forms. And in the past, of course, there also used to be some other forms for the second person singular, chiefly, which were art, wast, and wert. And then there were some other dialectal forms too, but those were kind of the main forms. In English today, the most forms that any other verb has is just 5. Most verbs would just have 4. So if you take a typical verb like, a new verb, the kind of new verbs we coin would have the regular conjugation with 4 forms. So like Google would have Google, Googles, Googled, and Googling. And that's it, right? It covers both participles. The past participle, I have Googled. The present participle, I am Googling, and then Google, Googles are the 2 present forms. Then there are irregular verbs like do that would have a 5th form because they have a separate past participle. So you'd have do, does as the 2 present tense indicative forms, and did is the regular past tense that is the preterite, and done is in I have done something as opposed to I did something, and doing as the gerund, the present participle. So irregular verbs would have 5, in English, have 5 different forms today. A regular verb would just have 4 forms, but to be has 8 forms, and that's the only one to have more than 5. How did it get so many forms? Well, it's not like part of it is just that Old English, as I mentioned in my last video, had a whole lot of cases, and cases for nouns, it also had a lot more declensions for verbs, so it had a lot more forms of verbs. But the main reason to be has so many forms today is because it's actually built out of 3 different verbs that collided together and that all sort of meant something like to be. And between Proto-Germanic and Middle English, they got conflated. They all became forms of one verb, and with some of the forms of each verb being lost. Those 3 verbs are the Old English verb beon, which in Proto-Germanic was beuna. I'm not sure, I guess that's a nasal there, beuna, something like that. And the verb weisana, or weisan in Old English. And a third verb that I guess wasn't even a separate verb in Proto-Germanic, but back in Proto-Indo-European it was a separate verb meaning something like es. And that's considered the basic to be verb because it gives the verb to be in lots of Indo-European languages. If you think about the word essence, that's from Latin via French, and is related to that root s in Proto-Indo-European, which is one verb meaning to be. So in Proto-European, these 3 verbs were his, or histi was another form of it. So his was one of the verbs in Proto-Indo-European, and histi was another. They both gave different forms of the Proto-Germanic verb weisana. And Then there was the third verb in proto-Indo-European, bu, which gave beon in Old English. There might have been a fourth one too to explain the R's. There we have an R and the older second person singular form art, but that may have also, they might also have just popped in because R's sort of go in and out in different dialects, like British speakers and speakers of Southern American dialects of English often drop R's, right? So R's can come in too because they're sort of like vowels, even though they're not quite vowels, and so it's not that uncommon for R's to just kind of pop up. A separate verb isn't needed. Okay, so to make that all a little clearer, because it's probably not super clear yet, I'll explain which specific forms came from which of these specific three verbs back in Proto-Indo-European. So be itself naturally came from the verb, I said, bu in Proto-Indo-European, which in Proto-Germanic became beuna, and then became beon in Old English. So that be is that's where we get the to be, the infinitive form of to be, and of course being and been look the same too. But in Old English, this was just its own verb, beon, and it was still kind of used interchangeably with wisan, the other to be verb that Old English still had. So they were almost kind of, because it didn't have its own past tense, so its past tense, for the past tense of this verb being in Old English, the past tense forms of wisan were used instead. For that reason, this verb is called suppletive, meaning that some of its forms is applied from another verb. It's made of different verbs amalgamated together. It's not simply, doesn't simply come from one ancestor. Anyway, the present tense indicative forms of beon in Old English were the first person singular was beo, then second person singular beast. Notice the st that you see on all the second person singular forms and even early modern English for thou, except for art. You'd say, thou seest, thou dost, whatever, right? So that was a standard thing that was inherited from Old English. So the second person singular form of beon was beast, third person singular beeth, which has the th that you see on archaic, so early modern English forms, third person singular forms of verbs. You'd say like he seeth or he seeketh or whatever. And then the plural form of beon was beoth. Interestingly, these forms, which we of course don't use today, right? None of those present indicative, none of the present indicative forms, am, is, am and am, are, is, even art, somewhat archaically, come from beon today. But dialectally, even in like the last, in certain areas of England still, at least certainly in the 20th century, descendants of these forms of to be were still existing, going back all the way to Old English, the descendants of the beon-derived present tense conjugation of to be. So in us, there's this dialectal use of bin as not related to there. In certain other dialects, it's evolved separately, but as the plural indicative form, it's obsolete. But if you look at like Shakespeare, here's a line from the late and much admired play called Pericles, Prince of Tyre, where someone says, "Where when men been, there's seldom ease." And that's just the present tense. Where when men been, it's just used as the plural form of to be. And let's see, there were other forms of to be like this too. Let me just see here. There's also so in Middle English, by Middle English, the two verbs beon and wisana that were still distinguished sort of in Old English had just merged into one, and the only infinitive was beon. And yeah, in Middle English, the first-person singular conjugation, it's the typical first-person singular form of this verb bein was am, which came from wisana, wisan, which I'll explain in a bit. But you could also say I be, and second person singular would be beast. Be spelled B-I-S-T. Third person singular could be beeth, but also art and is. And these forms, beast and beeth, can still be found in certain dialects. Beast is found in the UK and apparently Black Country, Bristol, West Country, Northern England. I don't live in the UK, so I'm not sure exactly where those all are, but apparently there. Well, let's see. Okay, you can still find people saying things like, where beast going, or how beast, or at least not too long ago you could find that. And similarly with beeth. So they go back to Middle English, and even before that, when we had these two different present tense conjugations of to be, the ones related to beon, and these other ones related to wisan. Now, as for the ones related to wisan, back in Old English, the forms of wisan were the first person singular was eom, which naturally later became am, and second person singular eart. Third person singular is, so those became am, art, and is, or it would have been pronounced is back then. It would have been eom, eart, is. And the plural, there were a few different plural forms. One was sind, and which was a certain form of one of the two verbs that gave wisan. Remember, as I said, this wisan verb, which came from Proto-Germanic, wisana, had forms from two different verbs. Back in proto-Indo-European, one whis gave the W form, the W past tense forms, which were was, where, whereon, other things like that whose descendants are was and were today. So even back in Old English, again, all the past tense forms of, except for the past participle, the other past tense forms, the past subjunctive and the past preterite, were started with W, and they went back ultimately to whis in Proto-Indo-European. One thing I'll say is that when you look at the when you apply the past tense to thou, if you're speaking archaically, you really should say either thou were or thou wast. Thou wert was originally, when people were actually saying thou all the time, thou wert was just used as the subjunctive. Just as you would say I were, if I were a rich man, that would be the present subjunctive applied to the first person singular. And if you were saying it for the second person singular, you would say, like, if thou wert a rich man. But if you're just using the simple indicative past tense for the second person, applying, speaking this simple indicative past tense, with the second person singular as the subject, you would just say thou wast. So that was really the prevailing form. But wast, wert, was, were, all go back to these past tense forms of wisan, and where this ultimately comes from Proto-Indo-European whis. Whereas the present tense forms of wisan go back to Proto-Indo-European his, the same root as of essence. And various other, the infinitive to be in a lot of in Latin, it's, I believe, esse. In French it's être, where the es becomes e. So in lots of European languages, the infinitive to be in most of the forms go back to the Proto-Indo-European verb his, and for us that just gave us is, and it gave us am. And R is a little weird. It's not clear exactly, like I said, that the R might have come from just some rhoticism, as it's called, but an R kind of just found its way in there. Norse was involved in that process, whereas eom and is came through one path from Proto-Germanic, The yard appears to have had some Old Norse influence, which makes sense because when the Vikings conquered England a couple times, I think, or mainly one time for several decades in like the 10th century, King Canute, who famously supposedly tried to stop the tides because he believed everything would follow his orders, even nature. Or maybe he did it to prove a point that he was lesser than God. It's not clear whether this story is based in fact at all, but anyway, King Canute was one of the Dane Kings of England. They spoke Old Norse at that time, and that's how that was able to influence Old English. Anyway, that might be where we have these R forms, art and art, but they probably ultimately also go back to the verb his. And this form sinned went back to the proto-Indo-European verb histi, which was a form of his too, but that's a form that died out. But we still see it we see forms related to sind in German today, so that used to be around in Old English. There was also a form rn instead of r. For some reason, an n got added on. That's another consonant that can just sort of get stuck on. Sometimes like r. But then, and that's still used dialectically. Sometimes people say are, not to mean aren't, but just to mean are in some parts of England. Or at least, again, that was true recently. So that's where, yeah, I said be and being, go back to bion, and was, were, wast, wert, archaically go back to wisan, and then further back to huiseti, and then in proto-Indo-European, and then histi or his in proto-Indo-European gave us the standard first-person singular forms via its different conjugations, am and probably art and is. And those are all so that's where all the basic forms come from. It seems like they're all unrelated, but they fall into those three groups. The W's all came from one verb, the B's all came from one verb. And then even though am and is don't sound that similar, they actually were conjugations of one verb, and art before it had the R was two. To give a little more intuition on that, we can look back at what his actually was in Proto-Indo-European. Its first-person singular back in Proto-European is thought to be something like hismi. So the M is the M and am. Second singular, hissi, somehow that turned into art. That's, the R is weird. Okay. Third singular, histi. So you see the is, the middle part, his is, histi became is. So really, am and is don't sound that much like hismi and histi, but that is where they came from. So that verb gave us the present tenses with whisti and proto-Indo-European gave us the past tenses, except for been, which along with be and being, of course, came from boo or came from boo and proto-Indo-European, which became beyond in Old English. So we have all these different verbs coming together and giving different forms, and that's how we get all the forms we have today. One other thing I'll say is when I'm pronouncing these Proto-Indo-European roots, there are H's in them, and we don't actually know how these H's sound. We think there were three different, mainly two, but a third one that occasionally occurs, H-like things that existed in Proto-Indo-European that we know only from the evidence of a little bit of evidence of some very early, poorly attested Indo-European languages in Anatolia, modern Turkey, like Hittite, mainly Hittite, I guess, and some other ones, Lurian, Lycian, Luwian, and Hurrian, but mainly Hittite, because the Hittite Empire was a big deal until it fell to the Sea Peoples and the Bronze Age collapse around the turn of the beginning of the first millennium BC. So we didn't have any evidence of the writing until the mid-20th century, and eventually, after famously getting a clue to what how to read their language from noticing a sentence that sounded an awful lot like we eat our bread and then we drink water with it, noticing, oh, this kind of looks like the Latin word for eat, and this kind of looks like the English word for water. A linguist whose name I forget just realized that it was probably this Hittite was probably a proto-Indo-European language, even though Turkish that's spoken in Turkey today is not, or sorry, is probably an Indo-European language, even though Turkish, which is spoken in Turkey today, is naturally is not Indo-European. It's Turkic. It comes from around an area of like Siberia and Mongolia. It comes from that region, where the Turks originally migrated. Even though they blended genetically with a lot of other peoples in the area of modern Turkey, their language comes from back there, and a lot of their culture too, I assume. Anyway, from looking at Hittite, we were able to see that there must have been these ghost consonants that we're not sure exactly what they were. There was something like H. They might have been something a little different, maybe more like or like, sort of a weird kind of H, like not quite the English H, or maybe not exactly an H. At first, it was thought that they were more like vowels, but in any case, they were dropped in basically all the Indo-European languages except for Hittite. But Hittite doesn't exist anymore. We only know a little bit about it from these inscriptions. So anyway, so that's why if you ever look at something, at what Proto-Indo-European roots are supposed to look like and how they're written, how they're transcribed, we don't write them in whatever cuneiform the Hittites use. We write them just with English letters to indicate the pronunciation, but you'll see these H subscript 1, H subscript 2, and H subscript 3. Those denote these three different H-like laryngeal, that is, phonemes that were present in Proto-Indo-European. So we don't know exactly what they sounded like, but with some kind of H's, with the H in Hesti, or which is a derivation of Hes. That was the oldest root that we know from Proto-European. They gave us am and is and are. That's H1, but the H in Whis, which gave us was and were, is H2, so the different H's. So Whis might be more like Whis. The first one might just be more like Hiss, the standard H, but we're really not sure how those H's were pronounced. Okay, and that's really all there is to say about the forms to be that I can think of, and next time we can talk about whatever the third most common word is in English, which is to, T-O, the preposition. We'll see where that came from.